Hi there. As U.S. Secretary of Defense James Mattis stops in Seoul on his Far East Asian tour to talk with South Korean Defense Minister Song Young-moo, DPRK and ROK officials are simultaneously meeting to discuss mutual real connections between the two Koreas. So, is there anything special behind this confluence of meetings? How is South Korea reacting to the freeze of U.S. military exercises? And what should be the next action by the DPRK to encourage a further diplomacy from the U.S.? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Scott Alexander Cinder, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Mr. Su Ge, co-chair of Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, and Ms. Jenny Tang, a research analyst with the Stimson Center. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted Pentagon Chief James Mattis at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. During the meeting, President Xi emphasized China's commitment to peaceful development, adding the country has no interest in expansionism or colonialism and will never cause chaos in the world. The trip comes amid tensions between Beijing and Washington. Last month, the Chinese Navy identified and expelled 2 U.S. warships that had entered illegally into China's territorial waters off the Shisha Islands in the South China Sea. President Xi said China and the U.S. share common interests in a wide range of areas, and these outweigh differences. He said the Pacific Ocean is large enough for China, the U.S., and other countries to share, adding China and the U.S. should focus on strengthening ties with mutual respect and cooperation in a way that benefits both sides. Speaking about China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, Xi said China should protect every inch of territory left by its ancestors and that the nation would never take any piece of territory from other countries. He and Mattis agreed on the importance of military ties between the two countries. President Xi said military ties are part of bilateral relations and should act as a stabilizing force in how the two countries deal with each other. Mattis agreed to enhance communication on strategy, adding military ties will become the strategic element of bilateral relations. During the second day of Mattis's trip, he attended a welcoming ceremony hosted by China's Defense Minister Wei Fenghe. Minister Wei said Mattis's visit will boost mutual trust between both militaries.
Your visit will give new positive elements to the relationship between our two countries and our two militaries.
Mattis said he expects to find room for military cooperation.
Contingent on us to carry out the guidance that President Xi and President Trump gave to us coming out of the Mar-a-Lago summit almost a year ago now.
And before Mattis's meeting with the Chinese president, the Foreign Ministry weighed in on military relations between China and the U.S. Now Mattis is starting his trip to the Republic of Korea.
Gentlemen, what do you think of the results, if any, or deliverables coming out of this meeting between President Xi Jinping and Secretary Mattis?
Well, I would say that the visit by the Secretary of Defense from the United States is an important visit at an important juncture. And President Xi Jinping personally met with him and had a, fairly long and in-depth talks with him. That shows that China attaches great importance not only to this visit, but behind it to the general U.S.-China relations. During the talk, you can see that President Xi Jinping talked about just the general direction, that is, we need to cooperation. The good relationship, a cooperative relationship between the two largest economies, not only is good for the two countries, but for the region, and in a sense, to the world. But during the meantime, President Xi Jinping also calls a spade a spade, saying that, for instance, the national defense, territorial integrity, and we do not need a single inch of territory from any foreign countries. However, for territories handed down from our ancestors, and we are bound to keep it.
What do you make of the agenda of Secretary Mattis? James. Are you surprised that China is the first of the whole package tour? It used to be the case that the U.S. President or the U.S. Secretary of Defense would visit their allies in Northeast Asia, but China has become the first. Maybe we are reading too much into it, but I'd like to have your thoughts.
Well, I think, there's great importance right now to continue strategic cooperation and to sort of reiterate those strategic ties. Given the situation with North Korea, I think, China-U.S. cooperation and continued cooperation on this matter, even as U.S.-DPRK relations starts to improve, and especially as China-DPRK relations starts to improve, having communication and cooperation, and it will be incredibly important going forward to make sure that we're all sort of moving in the right direction, in the same direction, and that we're not undermining each other's efforts in that process. So I think it makes a lot of sense to come to China first, especially given the rising tensions between U.S. and China, to see, to make sure that we have still some ties and we can still figure out ways to work together on these issues, especially the military aspects, even if there's problems in some of the more economic aspects.
Scott, I wonder if you have followed my suit in reading in between the lines of the official statement. Forget about the open official statement, the diplomatic rhetoric. Anything below or underlying? I mean, what is the understatement, the messages that Secretary Mattis really wants to deliver to the Chinese side?
Well, I think that Secretary Mattis, one of the messages is related to the fact that the U.S. is continuing to focus on the status quo, and that includes freedom of navigation operations. But it also means that the U.S. and China need communication on strategic issues, including the Korean Peninsula. And I'm sure that the fact that he came here at this particular time, provides a note of assurance in the context of a lot of unpredictable issues.
Even at the height of the Cold War, some kind of a connections or channels for the communication between Washington and Moscow were maintained to manage a crisis. Today, many people are talking about a new Cold War descending on Far East Asia between the United States and China due to a lot of things: mistrust, territorial disputes, freedom of navigation, so on and so forth, particularly the trade war that has really undermined the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. How important is the mill-to-mill talks? Do you think this is a positive move or just a symbolic one? Don't take it very seriously. After all, the new Cold War is to break out.
Well, that's an excellent question, but it's a very difficult one. Well, if you say that there is a so-called coming of the Cold War, and personally, I would say that we need to wait a moment before we reach that kind of conclusion. For instance, when you look at the Cold War, the coming of the Cold War years, 1947, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and so on, and there was the Mr. X long telegram, saying that the Soviet Union is totally different, having a totally different political system, and the
8,000-word cable
wants to, the long cable, and wants to have a containment policy. But look at today, U.S. and China, we have there's a multitude of interests just intertwined together. For instance, the economy, I personally still feel that the U.S. and China, we have a complementary economies. And then just look at the students and going abroad and so on and so forth. Even though, of course, there is the descending of the coming up of this tensions of the economic like a trade war. But I think that in the end, trade war does not serve anybody's interest. China does not
for sure,
there's
going to be no winner for any war. Trade war or
we do not want to start a trade war. But if you push her to the corner, then we have to respond. But anyway, my personal view is that in the end, we still need to find a way for negotiations, even tough negotiations.
Jenny and Scott, is it true that President Trump doesn't have a serious strategy, a consistent one, about Asia? They have figured out, and the bipartisan consensus says loud and clear, that China is the most menacing strategic competitor according to their 3 landmark policy documents. Then, what would be the reactions? I mean, it seems that the United States has not figured out what should be the most proper policy option in dealing with this rising power. You have made it very clear you are a strategic competitor, but we have not figured out how to deal with this rising power. Is it true, Scott?
I would say that we see where the institutional bureaucracy is going with those 3 documents. But then President Trump, I think his style is very unconventional, and his approach in some ways depends on uncertainty maximization as a tactic by which to achieve his objectives. And so it's hard, I think, to say that there is a full-on government coordinated strategy in dealing with these issues. But we can definitely see a set of impulses from President Trump that are really unique to his particular brand and approach as a president.
Jenny, should we read more of his presidential tweets or the official statements of the Pentagon, the White House? I mean, we don't know whom we should be talking to.
Well, I think we're still trying to figure that out in America as well, because there is often discord between what the president tweets from day to day even versus what different cabinet members are saying. And I think, it does reflect a little bit of the confusion you talked about as to how do we now deal with the strategic competition, because it is real kind of strategic competition. And in some light, I don't think there is a real consensus. And I think, Trump is a very transactional president and is sort of looking for how do I get a certain transaction, but hasn't necessarily thought through the full ramifications and spillover implications of those specific actions in that process.
Scott, would you call this a strategic competition also geopolitical rivalry?
There's a turn toward a harder edge in the U.S.-China relationship, and I take seriously the fact that the U.S. government is identifying China as a competitor. But I don't believe that the phrase New Cold War is really appropriate to describe what we are experiencing. In some ways, using the phrase Cold War brings historic analogies that are inappropriate to the current situation because the countries are so economically interdependent. And so I think this is going to play out in a different way, but we are seeing a rise in competition amidst cooperation.
Do you agree with Professor Graham Allison about the Thucydides tribe?
Well, certainly it is the case that emerging powers and established powers have a particular history that has been identified, but I don't think that we should necessarily fall into the trap of believing that events are foreordained. And so I think there is a lot that can be done in order to try to work out the issues that accompany the rising power challenge in the context of an established power environment.
Maybe this long journey of probing and searching for a solution is well underway. Neither side has a clear answer about how to treat each other. Now, having said this, let's look at the DPRK, which is, of course, a touchstone. Do you think the railway will really help introduce the rapprochement between the two Koreas?
Well, before I answer that question, let me just pick up what you said about the U.S.-China relationship. Earlier, when President Xi Jinping met with Secretary of Defense Mattis, he actually used again the analogy. The Pacific Ocean is Pacific. It's so wide. And the United States and China, the two of us, we can live happily and peacefully together in this Pacific region. And in fact, that China, if you call China's policies both domestic and international, if there are two things we want to avoid, the first one is to avoid the Thucydides trap, to avoid confrontation between the biggest and the second largest economies. And domestically, we want to avoid a middle income trap. Well, North Korea, earlier in this film strip, there was a mention of the railroad. And I just happen to be in both the south and the north of the peninsula. I know that for any country, the most important thing is to guarantee its political stability and economic development. The south, with regards to north and south cooperation, and finally paving way for the national unification, the south has proposed a number of rail line linkages between the north. For instance, at least they proposed 3. One is that along the east coast for sightseeing, King Kong Shan, and then the other through the east side to link the Russian Far East. Another one, that's probably the most important one, from Seoul and across the 38 parallel to link the Pyongyang, and then Xinjiang, and then Dandong, and all the way to Peking. And so these are 3 lines. In the end, I think that would serve for the pave way for economic prosperity.
Hopefully, in the next 3 years, President Moon Jae-in and President Kim Jong-un will share coffee and vodka on board the train, bullet train from Seoul, Pyongyang to Beijing. Right?
Even not up to the bullet trains, just a regular, fairly fast trains. But now the question is, what about the security concern? What about the sanctions, whether they are lifted, how far the North is going to go, whether they are going to meet the U.S. criteria on the denuclearization or not. So that would be the question between the North and the South, and between the South and the United States.
Exactly. When we talk about the blueprint of having co-prosperity through the infrastructure or building of the infrastructure, like the high-speed railway, what about the UN sanctions? Will it be lifted pretty soon? Is it part of the package that President Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un reached the consensus, namely in the summit in Singapore?
Well, I think it's really hard to say what those details were, because clearly the declaration that came out of the summit did not have any of those details, just sort of a broad agenda as to what now needs to be negotiated.
Were you disappointed when you first read the statement?
Absolutely. We expected at least a little bit more detail, including a mutual understanding of what denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula actually means to both sides, as well as some sense of timing going forward of what to expect. We didn't even get that level of detail, and this was even less detail than what we've had in previous summits, in previous agreements in the past. So I think there is probably the public messaging has been no sanctions relief until there's tangible moves. The question is had they agreed to something that would bring about tangible moves, and how quickly then you would start to lift sanctions to allow some projects like this to take place. But we simply don't know those answers. And clearly the North Koreans are going to be looking for sooner rather than later, and will not be favorable to a backloaded process. But there has to be some clear benchmarks as to what qualifies as being worthy of starting to actually
Let me tell you the hallmarks, and I hope if you like you can correct my statement. He has suspended nuclear and missile tests. He has blasted the nuclear testing venue, which is very close to our border in Dongbei. So these 3 things are enough to persuade policymakers in the White House. Mr. Kim Jong-un is very serious about the CVID of the denuclearization process. So what do you think of the decision by President Trump to suspend the joint military maneuvers between the Pentagon and the ROK?
That was a big surprise, I think, for everybody concerned, because really it's not the way that the U.S. has usually done business. But what's really interesting is that it does kind of call North Korea's bluff. It actually provides North Korea with a signal of positive intent by the United States toward North Korea. And now the question is whether North Korea will reciprocate and take yes for an answer to the idea that the U.S. might actually be willing to reduce tensions and normalize its relationship with North Korea.
And do you think, to begin with, Ambassador Su, the DPRK got to cooperate completely with the American team to help bring back and bring home the remains of the the missing servicemen and women in the Korean War. That will help reconstruct the trust, the very important issue between the two countries, right?
An excellent question. As for the bringing back the remains and also of men and missing in action, and I think that's the least difficult of all these. The most difficult thing is the thing that the gap and the barrier between the understandings held by both. Whether you want to, just now you mentioned the word completely. What do you mean by completely? The CVID, now it was turned into CG, without a V and I. Complete, verifiable, irreversible, and destruction. That the Koreans want, the North Koreans want guarantee for their peace. Finally, you just see two things. Well, they promised final, eventual complete destruction, that as the eventual end, and eventually the United States would agree to give them guarantee. But now I hope that, of course, after negotiations, and there is a lot of, it's a process, and you expect a lot of give and take. But to start with, I agree with my friend here on that. Well, it's not a perfect agreement to start with. But I would like to differ a little bit. That is for a country which has been formed throughout history of such a magnitude, probably you cannot expect a thorough settlement in one go. I think that for this process, I would like to use a French word, that is petit à petit, little by little. But this agreement like this is conducive to peace and security.
Probably President Kim
better than nothing.
Excuse me, perhaps Mr. Kim Jong-un just wants to use this landmark agreement in Singapore as something to buy time. Do you think eventually the DPRK will be committed to complete destruction of its nuclear capability? Are you skeptical or cautiously optimistic? What is your sentiment, Scott?
We are a long way from complete denuclearization. That process would probably take a decade.
Are you suggesting in your understatement that what President Trump really wants is to have a Nobel Peace Prize and campaign victory of midterm elections?
Well, President Trump's time frame for the elections is 2 years, and I think he wants to make progress in the right direction within that 2 years. But Kim Jong-un's time frame is 20 or 30 years, and so that means that Kim Jong-un has plenty of opportunity, possibly in theory, to move in a different direction long after Trump is gone.
Jenny, as an American with Korean ethnicity, are you optimistic about a North Korea that's open up like what happened in China 40 years ago under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping? Open up the borders, open up the economy, seriously reform the state-owned enterprises and give foreign investment a chance. I mean, what is your sentiment?
You know, with North Korea, nothing is impossible. But at the same time, you know, I think it would take a lot to get there, and it's not going to move quickly. And, you know, from the North Korean perspective, the road to denuclearization is paved by having a fundamentally different political relationship with the United States, with the U.S. allies, and with the rest of the world, not the other way around. And I think the way the U.S. has always approached this issue has been give up your nuclear weapons first, and then you can have that different political relationship. And for security guarantees to mean anything to the North Koreans, there has to be consistency over time of a very different relationship than what we have right now. And having, you know, security guarantees on paper simply isn't going to cut it, because we've seen, you know, how agreements have not been able to withstand or to be sustained from administration to administration. So if you're Kim Jong-un, for instance, your time horizon is not one presidency, because you cannot trust that, you know, an agreement from one presidency to the next is going to hold, and that those security guarantees are going to hold. What you would want to see is a pattern of behavior over at least 2 presidencies, both in both in the U.S. and in South Korea as well, because those policies tend to shift dramatically from administration to administration as well. So, I think there's a lot that can be done in the meantime to move down the right path and to get into a better place and to improve that relationship. But I think in order to get to the end of that path, I do think we have to give a little bit of faith to the process. And I think, there is room for Kim Jong-un to make a lot of decisions because North Korean society is evolving, and I think he does want to be at the forefront of that rather than being dragged kicking and screaming behind.
In a short period of 3 months, Mr. Kim Jong-un came over hat in hand to see President Xi Jinping. Most Americans, including most Chinese, were caught unprepared by both the glow and the stylish ceremonies as well as the substance of the talks themselves between President Xi Jinping and Mr. Kim Jong-un. What do you think of the Chinese influence that we may still leverage on the DPRK? Because many Chinese have become very skeptical. There's a limit to what we can do given the economic sanctions and let me be frank, according to the survey of opinion polls online, netizens in their thousands don't take the DPRK very seriously. They have to think twice about why we are the only ally of this country.
I think a lot of Americans are very skeptical about Chinese intentions as related to the Xi-Kim meeting. I happen to be one who believes that China's influence is limited and its options are limited. And really China is just hoping that we hit the sweet spot. Don't push North Korea too hard, but don't let them off the hook. And in fact, we're going to need cooperation between the U.S. and China, especially on continuing sanctions and a formula for engagement with North Korea in order to achieve that.
Very quickly, what do you think of the prospects of reaching a peace agreement, with China being one of the parties, of course, because we were involved in the Korean War? Very quickly, Ambassador Su.
Well, China's role has always been there because we want to see denuclearization in the peninsula. We want to see peace and stability, and we made specific suggestions, including the double concession and dual suspension approaches. But it seems that the path is moving along, is in that direction, and we want peaceful talks.
As part of the complete peace and security guarantee, I'm afraid the peace agreement is badly needed for the DPRK. And what do you think of the future?
Well, I think there's two different paths forward, and one is you have a declaration to end the war, and then you can negotiate a peace regime, versus trying to negotiate a peace treaty all at once. And I think those are two very different things. And I think if we can get at least the declaration that the war is over, I think it does, again, open doors to a different type of negotiation going forward and a different type of relationship going forward.
Scott?
The key to a peace declaration or a peace treaty is going to be tension reduction, real tension reduction on the peninsula. And without that, any declaration is just going to be a piece of paper. So what I'm watching is what can the two Koreas do with support from the United States in order to pull back troops, pull back equipment, and make the demilitarized zone a demilitarized zone.
DMZ and the 38th parallel remain the Berlin Wall in the Far East Asia. Thank you for your participation in this dialogue at CGTN. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.